Ever get that feeling? Like when you're really wrestling with some big philosophical idea that kind of just like underpins entire schools of thought. Well, that's kind of what we're going for today. But without needing to spend weeks poring over dense texts, think of this as like the express lane into the heart of Robert Nozick's political philosophy.
Yeah.
A thinker who, really shook things up back in the day and still gets philosophers like yourself debating.
Absolutely. And speaking of philosophical engagement, that's exactly who we're talking to today, someone who's already deep in these discussions. Our goal, really distill Nozick's libertarian doctrine down to its essence, not just summarizing, but like highlighting the most important moves in his arguments and how they might make you rethink these issues.
Exactly. And, we're mainly working from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Nozick, a solid, reliable source, as I'm sure you know.
Oh, definitely. Very rigorous.
Yeah. So our mission, if you will, is to pull out those really philosophically potent parts of his work, figure out the logic behind them, and then see what they tell us about the state and individual liberties. Big stuff.
Big stuff indeed. Now, Robert Nozick, as I'm sure you're aware, was a major figure in 20th century American philosophy. And his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which came out in 1974, that's really the core of what we're digging into today. And it wasn't just some popular philosophy book, It won the National Book Award and really challenged the prevailing philosophical views at the time, especially those that lean towards more state intervention.
Right. And it's important to remember the whole philosophical scene back then. Nozick was going head-to-head with people like Rawls, offering this powerful counter-argument to theories of justice that were all about redistribution. And a central point, the thing his whole argument rests on, is this idea that individual rights are untouchable. They're the ultimate test for whether any state action is justified.
Exactly. And that unwavering commitment to individual rights, that's what leads him straight to advocating for the minimal state, a state whose only job, its only legitimate function, is protecting those fundamental rights, life, liberty, property, and making sure contracts are enforced. That's the core of the libertarianism we'll be unpacking for you today, from, a philosophical angle, of course.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Individual rights. Nozick famously said, individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. Yeah. Pretty straightforward, huh? But these aren't just like rights that some political process grants you, are they? They go deeper than that.
Oh, way deeper. For Nozick, these are pre-political rights. Like, they exist in a state of nature. They aren't given to you by governments. They come before any government, and they actually limit what any government or any person or group, for that matter, can do. They're like the foundation, the bedrock that any just social order has to be built on.
And he's really clear that these rights are mainly negative. It's about what can't be done to you, what limits there are on others' actions, not what others have to provide for you.
Right. That's a key philosophical distinction. Not entitlements to things, but freedom from certain kinds of interference. And Nozick argues that these negative rights, they come from something essential about us, about being human.
So what is it then? What's the philosophical grounding for these inherent rights? He admits his book doesn't offer a complete theory, but what's the core intuition he's working with?
He points to, the fact that every individual is their own distinct being, right? With their own life to live, their own goals, their own projects. He emphasizes that we're separate, each of us. And while he says he doesn't have a fully worked out, a precise theory of the moral basis of individual rights, he's implying that it's our capacity for self-directed action, the inherent value of our individual existence, that makes these rights so fundamental.
It's interesting, isn't it, how he kind of echoes Rawls's critique of utilitarianism here.
Yeah.
The whole idea that people are separate beings, so you can't just add up everyone's well-being and ignore how it's distributed.
Oh, absolutely. It's like, just as Rawls argues against sacrificing some people's well-being for the supposed greater good of the majority, Nozick takes that idea a step further. He says there's no overarching social entity that can actually experience sacrifice. There are only individuals, each with their own unique life. And to use one person just as a means to benefit others, that's a violation of their fundamental separateness and inviolability. You can't justify that with some kind of societal cost-benefit analysis. Morally, it just doesn't work.
So for Nozick, what it boils down to is my life, my choices can't be overridden just to maximize some measure of overall social good.
That's it. That's a cornerstone of his whole approach. And this bedrock belief in the separateness of persons, that's what leads directly to his idea of rights as side constraints.
Side constraints. Now, for our philosopher listeners, how can we understand this concept in the context of moral action?
Imagine this. The right not to be intentionally killed, for example, that acts as a side constraint on what anyone can do. It's not just about, like, minimizing killings in general, right? It's an absolute rule about how we can act, even if breaking that rule in one instance might somehow lead to fewer killings overall in the long run. The constraint defines the boundaries of what's permissible, no matter the intended outcome.
So even if a utilitarian calculation said, hey, violating this one person's right will actually lead to fewer rights violations overall, Nozick's framework would say, nope, that initial violation is still wrong.
Precisely. Rights, for Nozick, they're not just factors to be weighed in some moral equation. They're the fundamental limits on what we can do. We can't treat individuals as mere tools, even if the goal seems really noble. He mentions things like sentience, rationality, free will, these capacities that might underpin these rights. The link is to our capacity for autonomous agency, for making our own choices.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry brings up something pretty interesting, something for philosophers to really chew on. This idea of the attenuation of rights, which he talks about in Chapter 4, seems to bring in this more, almost consequentialist kind of element. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, that's definitely a complex and debated part of his work. So at first, Nozick is exploring whether all boundary crossings, all potential violations of rights, should be absolutely forbidden. And surprisingly, he considers the possibility that maybe not all of them should be. Some might be okay, but only if the person whose rights are violated gets due compensation.
Compensation.
Here.
That suggests we're moving away from this absolute inviolability, right? Towards a system where you make amends after the fact. How does that square with the idea of rights as these side constraints?
It's in this particular chapter that Nozick seems to be playing with the idea of rights being protected by what are called liability rules instead of the stricter property rules. And this distinction is really important for understanding his whole argument against anarchism, which we'll get to in a bit.
Okay, so liability rules versus property rules. For our philosophically minded listeners, what's the key difference? How do they frame entitlements?
So let's say you have an entitlement to something, like your bodily integrity, right? If that's protected by a property rule, it means others generally can't infringe on it without your consent. Doesn't matter what kind of compensation they offer, you get to decide what happens to your body. But if it's protected by a liability rule, well, then others might be able to infringe on it as long as they're willing and able to pay for the harm they caused to provide what's called due compensation.
That's a pretty big shift from the intuitive notion of fundamental rights. So in this initial exploration, is he saying my right not to be harmed is basically just a right to be compensated if I'm harmed?
Yeah, that's the possibility he's considering in that chapter. But as the entry points out, this leads to some pretty tricky ethical and practical problems, especially when you're dealing with fundamental rights. Like, how on earth do you adequately compensate someone for, say, being killed or for being enslaved? The entry highlights these issues, along with the problem of fear and the fact that you'd have to negotiate the due compensation beforehand, which is, well, kind of impossible in many cases.
It does seem pretty problematic philosophically to say that core rights are just subject to some system of monetary payoff.
It does, and the entry emphasizes that Nozick himself seems to back away from this liability rule idea later in the book, especially when he's developing his theory of justice and holdings. There, he goes back to a stronger property rule understanding, where the focus is on your right to control and decide how your property is used, and that includes your own body and labor.
So this whole liability rule thing, it's more like a temporary exploration, a tool he uses in his specific argument against anarchism, rather than a complete rethinking of how all rights work in his theory.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, philosophically speaking. While it plays a crucial role in his attempt to justify how a minimal state could emerge from a state of anarchy, the more lasting view of rights in Nozick's work, it aligns much more closely with property rules. The emphasis is on control, inviolability, and this idea of self-ownership, even though he doesn't explicitly use that term in Part 1.
Okay, so we've laid out Nozick's philosophical foundation for individual rights. Now let's move to the big question of Part 1. Why have a state at all? He's tackling the challenge that individualist anarchism throws down, this idea that any state, even a minimal one, is just wrong.
Right. The individualist anarchist, coming from this rights-based perspective, says that even a minimal state is morally unjustified. They argue that individuals have rights, including the right to defend themselves and their rights, but they see these as positive rights that should be secured through voluntary agreements, probably within a competitive market of private protection agencies. They think this would naturally lead to a dominant protective association.
And what are the main philosophical objections anarchists raise against the very idea of a state, even one that's limited in what it does.
Two big ones stand out. First, they say the state always relies on coercive taxation to get its funding, and they see that as a violation of individual property rights, basically forced taking of legitimately owned resources. Second, they object to the state claiming a monopoly on the legitimate use of force and how it uses that force to shut down competing voluntary protection agencies.
So it's really important that the entry points out how Nozick's minimal state aims to avoid taxation altogether, at least in its initial emergence.
Absolutely crucial. Unlike many defenses of limited government, Nozick's argument for the minimal state doesn't depend on justifying taxation, at least not at first. He's mainly focused on responding to that second objection, how a dominant protective agency can become a monopoly without doing anything morally wrong.
So how does he do it? How does Nozick, engaging with this philosophical challenge, argue that this monopoly on force is actually permissible?
He suggests that providing protection for rights might be what's called a natural monopoly. Basically, the more clients a protective agency has, the more valuable its services become. A larger network means more comprehensive protection and a better way to resolve disputes among its members. So people might naturally, voluntarily, choose to join the biggest, most effective association.
But just because people choose to join doesn't automatically give that dominant agency the right to forcibly prevent smaller, non-aggressive competitors from operating. That's the sticking point for the anarchists, right?
Exactly. And this is where that earlier, somewhat controversial idea of the liability rule comes in. Remember how in Chapter 4, Nozick was exploring that? He uses that here to say that the rights of those smaller, non-outlaw agencies aren't absolute prohibitions against interference. They're more like claims to be compensated if someone messes with their operations.
Okay, I see where he's going with this. By framing these competing agencies' rights as liability claims, the dominant agency could justify some level of intervention, as long as they pay up. But how does that bridge the gap to a legitimate minimal state?
Here's the key. Nozick distinguishes between different types of protection agencies. You've got outlaw agencies that are actually violating rights themselves, well-behaved agencies that aren't really a threat, and moderately risky agencies whose procedures, while not outright criminal, might increase the risk of rights violations for others. He argues the dominant association can use force against the outlaw agencies, no problem. But for the moderately risky ones, he invokes this principle of compensation.
Compensation for what, specifically? What harm are they being compensated for?
Compensation for the disadvantage they experience, both the agencies and their clients, by being prevented from doing their chosen protective activities, even if those activities are potentially risky. Nozick's argument is that if the dominant association restricts these activities to make everyone else safer, then they owe something to those who are worse off because of that restriction.
And it's this obligation to compensate that gives rise to the minimal state.
Yep. He suggests that this compensation naturally takes the form of the dominant association now acting like an ultra-minimal state, with the power to oversee all protective activities, providing free or subsidized protection to those who are disadvantaged by its restrictions on the moderately risky agencies. And when this ultra-minimal state starts funding these compensatory services through fees from its paying customers, well, then it becomes the fully fledged, legitimate minimal state.
It's a pretty intricate, maybe even counterintuitive way to argue for the state's emergence. And it really hinges on that initial idea of rights as liability claims.
It does. The entry also briefly mentions a second argument Nozick makes, based on what he calls procedural rights. This is the idea that you have a right to not be subjected to unreliable or unfair processes of justice. And the dominant association, because it's bigger and can have more standardized procedures, might be seen as better at upholding those procedural rights. But as the entry notes, this line of reasoning faces some serious challenges.
And the entry highlights some unique features of Nozick's minimal state, especially the fact that it doesn't rely on taxation and how it resembles a big private company more than a traditional government.
Exactly. It's a very particular and you could say idealized type of state. It doesn't have the usual political structures and funding mechanisms we associate with governments. And the entry even brings up an interesting counterfactual. Nozick could have argued for a more conventional minimal state that's funded by taxes, saying that providing basic protection is a kind of compensation that justifies the taxes. But his preference for what's called an invisible hand explanation probably led him to take this more indirect route.
Invisible hand, meaning an outcome that happens unintentionally from people just acting in their own self-interest.
Exactly. Nozick wants to show how a minimal state could just emerge organically, without anyone planning it, just from individuals trying to protect their own rights. The dominant protective association basically stumbles into becoming a state.
That's a pretty powerful philosophical move.
Yeah.
He's trying to ground the state's legitimacy in voluntary actions, not some social contract or explicit agreement. And the entry wraps up this section by mentioning Bader's interpretation, which suggests that Nozick's hypothetical account of how the minimal state emerges actually gives us a reason to demand that existing, bigger states be transformed into minimal ones. It's like a matter of political rectification.
Right. Bader's argument is that Nozick gives us this normative ideal, this picture of the political structure that would justly emerge from a state of nature. So we have grounds to push for dismantling any state that goes beyond those minimal boundaries.
All right, so we've looked at how Nozick justifies the minimal state. Now let's dig into part 2 of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, where he argues against any bigger role for the state, especially when it comes to redistributing wealth. This is where his famous theory of justice and holdings takes center stage, especially in Chapter 7.
Definitely. Here, Nozick is directly challenging the legitimacy of any state that goes beyond protecting rights and enforcing contracts. He's focused on what he calls the historical entitlement doctrine of justice and holdings.
Historical entitlement. Now, for our philosophically inclined audience who are used to thinking about distributive justice in terms of end states or patterns, what's the big shift in thinking that Nozick is proposing?
The main idea is that whether someone's current holdings, their wealth, possessions, whatever, depends entirely on the history of how they got those holdings. There are only 3 just ways to acquire holdings: by justly taking something that was unowned before, by justly transferring something, like through voluntary exchange, gifts, inheritance, or by justly correcting a past injustice.
So if I can trace the ownership of my stuff back to one of those just ways of getting it, then my current holdings are just, no matter how wealth is distributed overall in society, or whether that distribution fits some ideal pattern.
That's the essence of Nozick's historical entitlement theory. It's a radical break from end-state principles, which judge the justice of a distribution just based on how it looks at a specific time, and pattern principles, which say distribution should reflect things like merit or need.
End-state principles like utilitarianism, which aims for maximum happiness, and pattern principles like egalitarianism or roles difference principle.
Yeah.
So Nozick is basically saying these kinds of considerations are irrelevant when deciding if someone's holdings are just.
Totally. He argues that these ahistorical principles completely ignore the morally significant processes by which people come to have what they have. To illustrate this, he uses the example of a society that achieved, say, an egalitarian distribution through forced labor or by taking people's property. Even if the end result looks equal the way it was achieved, the unjust history would make it unjust according to Nozick's framework.
Yeah, that makes intuitive sense. And then there's his famous how liberty upsets patterns argument, which he often illustrates with the Will Chamberlain scenario. This is a direct challenge to anyone who wants to maintain a specific pattern of distribution.
Right. It's a really powerful thought experiment that shows the inherent tension between individual freedom and trying to keep a specific distribution of wealth. Imagine a society where the resources are perfectly distributed according to your favorite pattern principle, whatever that is. Now, along comes this wildly popular basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain, and he makes a deal with his fans. They each voluntarily agree to pay him a small amount to watch him play. Over time, Chamberlain ends up with a ton of money, and the overall distribution of wealth in society no longer fits the original pattern.
So a distribution that was considered just according to some pattern becomes unjust just because people freely chose to make these transactions.
Exactly. Nozick's point is that to get back to that original pattern, or to keep it in place, you'd have to constantly interfere with people's voluntary exchanges. You'd be restricting their freedom to do what they want with their legitimately acquired resources. He famously asks, if the people were entitled to dispose of the resources to which they were entitled, under D1, didn't this include their being entitled to give it to or exchange it with Wilt Chamberlain? It highlights the conflict between enforcing a pattern and respecting individual liberty and property rights.
So it seems like he's saying that respecting individual freedom will inevitably mess up any predetermined pattern of distribution.
That's a core part of his argument against patterned principles. He sees these constant efforts to maintain patterns as inherently coercive, as violating people's rights to control their own justly acquired property. Now, theorists like Rawls argue that their principles are meant to shape the basic structure of society, the rules within which entitlements are earned and honored, and that taxes and regulations are just predictable parts of that system. But Nozick would probably counter that even with those preset rules, you'll still need to constantly interfere in unpredictable ways to counteract the effects of people's free choices and changing circumstances.
And then there's his argument that redistribution is basically a violation of property rights. Even comparing it to one person partially owning another, that's a pretty strong philosophical claim.
It is. He argues that taxing someone's earnings to redistribute wealth is like taking a part of their labor and using it for things they didn't choose. He sees this as infringing on their right to self-ownership, even though, again, he doesn't explicitly use that term in this context. Basically, he's saying it gives others a claim on part of that person's life and effort without their consent.
Now, Nozick does address Locke's proviso on initial acquisition. The idea that taking something that was unowned is only just if it leaves enough and is good for others. How does Nozick interpret and apply this important condition?
Nozick's interpretation of the Lockean proviso is something philosophers debate a lot. Basically, he argues that an initial acquisition is just as long as it doesn't leave others worse off than they would have been if that thing hadn't been acquired. He's focused on whether others are worse off overall in terms of their well-being or opportunities, not just whether there's physically enough of that resource left for everyone else. He tends to think that free markets generally satisfy this proviso because even those who don't acquire unowned resources benefit from the increased productivity and innovation that private property encourages. He treats it more like a liability rule. If no one is harmed on net, the acquisition is okay.
And what about the issue of rectifying historical injustices? After all, the way holdings are currently distributed is often a result of past wrongs like slavery and taking land from people.
Nozick acknowledges how significant historical injustices are and recognizes that the current distribution of wealth is often rooted in actions that were wrong. He admits that coming up with a complete theory of rectification, figuring out who owes what to whom for past wrongs, is really complicated. It needs detailed information about past events and their consequences. He suggests that without perfect historical knowledge, we might consider some kind of rough, class-based reparations, maybe even guided by some end-state considerations, though he acknowledges how difficult that would be and how it could lead to new injustices.
So while his ideal theory of justice is purely based on historical entitlement, he grapples with the practical challenges of applying it to a world where history is full of injustices.
Exactly. The theory of rectification is one of the less developed and more debated parts of his work, but he doesn't ignore the moral need to address past wrongs.
Finally, let's turn to part 3 of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, where Nozick lays out a vision of utopia that's closely tied to his minimal state. His goal here is to show that his idea of a just state isn't just some bare minimum, but can actually be inspiring.
Right. He presents the minimal state as a framework for utopia, not a blueprint for one specific ideal society, but a structure that enforces people's fundamental rights and creates a space where diverse voluntary communities can thrive, each pursuing their own idea of the good life. People will be free to join and leave these communities as they choose.
So instead of one utopian vision that everyone has to live under, Nozick imagines many different utopias coexisting peacefully within the minimal state's protection.
Exactly. He thinks this framework is inspiring precisely because it allows for the widest possible range of human flourishing. Different people and groups have different values and ideas about how to live, and this framework accommodates that diversity. It lets them form and be part of communities that match their ideals. It recognizes that no single utopian vision is perfect and embraces a pluralistic approach.
He calls this framework a discovery procedure, suggesting that the best ways to live and organize society will come about through this voluntary experimentation.
Yes. This framework allows different communities to emerge, compete for members, and adapt based on people's choices and experiences. It's similar to Mill's idea of experiments in living and Hayek's concept of spontaneous order. We don't have perfect knowledge about the best ways to live, so this framework lets us discover them through voluntary association and learning by doing.
And this is where he challenges socialist utopians, arguing that his framework allows people to pursue socialist ideals without forcing anyone.
Exactly. He says that if socialist communities are truly appealing, people will choose to join and participate in them within this framework. He even uses the example of kibbutzim and asks why socialists would object to a system that lets them create and maintain their own utopian communities voluntarily.
It sounds like he's presenting the minimal state as a neutral platform where different utopian visions can be tested and pursued without coercion?
That's a key part of his argument in Part 3. He suggests that this framework offers another reason to support the minimal state, a reason that's independent of the moral arguments for individual liberty and property rights he made in Parts 1 and 2. It's based on an epistemological claim. that voluntary association and experimentation are the most reliable ways to find better ways of living, given that we don't have perfect knowledge about what the ideal society would be.
But what about people who are so convinced of their own utopian vision that they want to force it on everyone, even those who disagree? Nozick calls these imperialistic utopians. How does his framework deal with them?
While the framework is designed to be open to lots of different voluntary communities, it implicitly excludes those who want to impose their vision on others by force. Nozick's justification for this, though he doesn't explicitly lay it out as a separate moral argument in this part, probably comes down to the idea that forcing a single vision on everyone undermines the whole process of voluntary experimentation and discovery that the framework is designed to promote. Imposing a single vision too early prevents us from learning and potentially discovering alternative, maybe even better, ways of living. The idea that voluntary, non-coercive discovery is better, epistemologically speaking, provides a strong reason to reject those imperialistic approaches.
So the framework allows for all these different utopian experiments to flourish through voluntary means, while also protecting everyone from having a single, potentially flawed vision forced on them.
Exactly. It's a vision of utopia not as some fixed blueprint to be implemented, but as a constant dynamic process of voluntary exploration and discovery within a framework of minimal constraints that respect individual rights.
Wow, this has been a really insightful journey through the political philosophy of Robert Nozick. We've explored his foundational belief in individual rights as inviolable constraints, his rigorous defense of the minimal state against the challenge of anarchism, his historically grounded entitlement theory of justice and holdings as a counterpoint to end-state and pattern principles, and his compelling vision of the minimal state as a vibrant framework for diverse, voluntary utopian experiments.
And for you, our philosophically engaged listener, we hope this deep dive has shed some light on the key arguments and underlying logic of Nozick's influential libertarian perspective. It's a perspective that continues to spark debate and shape how we think about politics today.
So, considering Nozick's powerful arguments,
Yeah.
how do you, as a philosopher, weigh the fundamental importance of individual liberty and property rights against the potential goals of a more extensive state, a state that aims to achieve social welfare or distributive justice? What kind of discovery procedure for organizing society do you find most philosophically compelling? It's a framework that definitely makes you think.
It does. And if this exploration of Nozick's ideas has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to delve deeper into anarchy, state, and utopia itself, and to explore the vast body of philosophical work that is engaged with his ideas. There's always more to discover and more implications to consider.